Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we celebrate the birthday of Chuck D, one of the great artists in all of history and a man who helped to change hip hop for the masses. Because if Public Enemy are remembered for anything, and they should be remembered for a lot, it's that they brought conscious hip hop to the mainstream. Now, I would argue that hip hop has its roots in conscious music. It has its roots in the poetry of people who the mainstream refuse to talk to, let alone write poetry for. And in that wonderful circumstance where necessity is the mother of invention, what early hip hop artists did is they did for themselves what the music industry, what politicians, what society, what the corporate world would not do for them. And that was create an art form that was accessible, that proved to be very marketable, and that was very direct in terms of storytelling, in terms of philosophizing, and in terms of conveying something with meaning in eras where the music industry always tended to gravitate towards the lighter, less meaningful pop music. Not that there isn't validity to that, but it didn't have the weight that a lot of the early hip hop artists had. There's there's a lot of controversy over when hip hop started, and you could say the same of just about any genre because nothing happens in isolation. Where did, for example, the classical school of European music end and the romantic begin? When did bebop end and hard bop begin in the world of jazz? Where did heavy rock turn into heavy metal in the world of rock, etc.? So there will be constant arguments about the origins of different genres. Certainly, one of my favorite artists you could definitely call a huge influence on hip hop was Gil Scott Heron. And he was very much someone who made conscious music, music about his people, music about society, music about his personal experiences. And that was something that Chuck D and Public Enemy very much did. So, Chuck D and Public Enemy weren't the first conscious hip hop artists, and they never claimed to be. But what they were the first conscious hip hop artists to really break through the mainstream. And they did so in the late 80s. Now, there was a lot of different kind of music going on in the late 80s, but it was at this time that I think you saw the biggest divergence between the mainstream of old and the mainstream of new that was rising up through the underground than at any time maybe since the 60s, when you had people like Frank Zappa, Frank Sinatra, and the Beatles all coexisting on the record charts, which kind of seems hard to believe, but they were. But try to imagine what was going on in the late 80s. You had people like Whitesnake coexisting with people like Kim Wilde, coexisting with Motley Crue, coexisting with artists like Jefferson Starship. Journey was still selling a lot of records. And this was, of course, very polished music. Some would say overly polished. Some would say that it was the music of glam and cocaine rather than the music of urban America. And there was some truth to that. It's not taking anything away from any artist. I love every genre of music, but there was that tension. And Public Enemy were one of the bands that really blew this open by bringing music from the East Coast underground to the mainstream of hip hop around the same time that on the West Coast, NWA and before that Ice-T brought the underground music of that coast to the mainstream. And what this all meant is that while the people that Chuck D was recording with and living with, the people in his black community from his part of the world, they understood much of, if not all of what Chuck D was rapping about. But mainstream America and later on the mainstream pop charts of the world, they really had no idea what was going on in places like the Bronx or Harlem or in the places on the West Coast that NWA and Ice-T were rapping about, South Central LA, Watts, Compton, etc., Oakland, great artists from there as well. And this was, again, in hindsight, it might seem difficult to believe if you're 18 or 19 and you grew up in a world of social media where you can see, where you can chat to a friend in Japan or China. You can see what's going on in Gaza in real time. You know up to the minute where political candidates are. Maybe you don't want to know that. You can see videos of real life events, whether it's crime, whether it's community organizations, whether it's fireworks shows, whether it's music shows, whether it's anything. You can see it all live. This was not the case in 1987. The stuff you saw live was limited to what CNN and a few others wanted you to see. And music, because of that, really had an important journalistic purpose. There were no online influencers, but there were Public Enemy, and they were influencers insofar as they influenced and changed the national discourse. It didn't happen overnight. There was, of course, a barrage of hatred that met them with their radical message, much as there is with any pioneering artists who come with a radical message that challenges the socioeconomic and artistic mainstream. But eventually, the kind of hip hop that Public Enemy were doing became the mainstream. And there was this golden age of hip hop where, yeah, the fun stuff certainly existed. You had the Two Live Crews and that, but you also had so many artists that were talking about reality. Ice Cube became very conscious. He always was, but even more so when he left NWA. MC Ren of NWA, the same thing. Ice-T had a lot of very conscious music as well as his fun and storytelling music. You had people like Tupac in his early days, and then you had the arrival of people like Cam on the West Coast, people like Paris, people like Ras Kass, people like Del the Funky Homo Sapien. Say that three times fast. So many. You had the Coup from Northern California, and you had this event between the late 80s and mid 90s where, in addition to other kinds of hip hop, conscious hip hop was permeating the mainstream. And Chuck D is absolutely at the top of that list for people who made that possible. Now, like any genre that begins organically, the mainstream will capture it once it becomes organically successful. And that's why by the early 2000s, there was still a lot of good hip hop, but I would say that much of it became watered down compared to that great 90s and late 80s era. But Chuck D remains a legend, and he remains very active in music. He became a hero to other people throughout the music listening scape in the late 90s when he stood up to people who wanted to get rid of Napster. He saw that it had the potential to democratize music, to put music back in the hands of the artists by limiting the middleman, eliminating the middleman between the artist and his or her audience. And I think that was really important. And now that's what a lot of young artists do. They release their own music. They become influencers. They sell merchandise. And people say, oh, well, better the artist profiting from the merchandise than a record label. That's what I think anyway. And all of that were among the many things that beyond the original Public Enemy albums were parts of, I would say, activism and philosophy and commentary that Chuck D engaged in. So a very happy birthday to a living legend, Chuck D. Like, subscribe. We will see you next time. Take care.